Many of us attend this breakfast every year to listen and learn from the experiences of people who have faced adversity and overcome obstacles. In listening to these stories, our hope is that you will be moved to learn more and take action to further justice in your piece of the world. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, according to the American Civil Liberties Union. There are 2.2 million people in the nation's prisons and jails, a 500% increase over the last 40 years. The results are overcrowding in prisons, families and communities pulled apart, and fiscal burden on local cities, counties, and states. Many of our current laws and policies limit the chances a person has for rehabilitation and reintegration into society, making the situation even worse.
According to the Sentencing Project, people of color make up 37% of the US population, but 67% of the prison population. African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested, and once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted, and once convicted, they are more likely to face stiff sentences. For more than 8 years, CCEJ has been engaged in the work to address the impact of incarceration, particularly on people from our African American and Latinx communities. Through the creation of the juvenile diversion programs based on restorative justice and high-quality training for schools and workplaces, CCEJ has been making our communities safer, more supportive, and empathetic while reducing unjust impacts of incarceration. But I'm not here just to give you numbers. It's important to put a face to the stories. And to help us understand more about these impacts, Taina Vargas-Edmond and Richie Reseda of Initiate Justice will share their personal stories with us. Please give them a warm welcome.
Good morning. I grew up during the era of the war on drugs, and my family was a casualty. My parents had addiction problems because of the trauma that they faced in their childhoods, and in my childhood, we grew up in poverty. For most of my life, we lived in motels or roach-infested small apartments. Our home was a violent place. It was not a safe place. And I grew up with the understanding that there was something dreadfully wrong in our society, that a child like me had to grow up in that way. When I was 14, my dad got arrested. And at that point, I didn't have a good relationship with him. I was calling him by his first name. I wasn't even calling him Dad because of all the harm that he had caused me. When he got arrested, to be honest, for a while, I didn't even notice he was gone. But one day I got a letter from him, and he was completely accountable. And he apologized to me for not being the best father that he could be. He told me that he wanted to get sober. He told me that he wanted to be the dad that I deserved. And in that moment, I really had no reason to trust him. I had no reason to believe that anything was going to be different. But I just thought if it was me and I was in a cage and I didn't have access to anybody on the outside, what would I need to be okay? I would want someone to support me and be there for me. So I wrote him back, and I told him that I forgave him, and that I believed that he was going to be sober, and that I wanted to rebuild my relationship with him again. And fast forward to many years later, my dad has been sober for 17 and a half years. And when he was released, he told me that I was the only person who wrote him. And that if it wasn't for me, and if it wasn't for my trust in him, and for my belief in him, and the hope that I gave him, then he would have never gotten sober and he would have never changed.
I grew up in a home that, much like in our greater society and culture, taught me that to be a real man, I couldn't have emotions. That I was supposed to be in control, money in my pocket, willing to be violent, and maintain control over others, most specifically women. This home, this culture, didn't allow me to be who I really was. It taught me that I wasn't good enough as a little boy, and that those things, control, domination, is what made me a real man. So that's who I chose to be. When I was 12 years old, I began using drugs. When I was 13, I began selling them. The heroes, the real men in my community were gang members, and that's exactly who I wanted to be. By the time I was 14 years old, I was failing out of school, addicted to drugs. And when I was 16, my high school principal asked me to drop out of school, and I did. The zero tolerance policies of LAUSD and Los Angeles County responded to my trauma and my bad choices, not with care or a desire to change my behavior, but with criminalization. I was arrested when I was 12, 13, 14, and 15 years old, all for what otherwise would be minor school infractions, like talking during an assembly or leaving school early to get a haircut. And by the time I was 16 and dropped out of school and kicked out of my house and living in the streets, I had decided that this is who I had to be, that even though the world has thrown me away, at least I was a real man.
So in 2011, I met Richard. We were both teacher's assistants at a preschool. He was great with the kids, fun guy. But as I got to know him a little bit more, I got to see some other sides of him. I saw that he had been involved with gangs. I saw that he had been involved with drugs. But I saw who he really was at his core. I saw a person who was smart, a person who was motivated, a person who was artistic and creative, and a person who I couldn't help but love.
Slightly before I met Taina, I had went to jail, to adult jail, for something that I didn't do, actually. And I got a DA reject and was kicked out of jail after a few days. And I had decided, much like the model of our current justice system wants us to decide, is that now I was scared of jail and I was going to do right instead. And that's when I got the job at the preschool where I met Taina. Unfortunately, the classroom that I worked in was closed down due to a lack of county funding, and because fear doesn't change people, and it certainly didn't change me, I decided to go back to doing what I knew how to do. And I senselessly committed 2 robberies and was fighting 150 years to life in prison at the age of 19.
So when Richard got arrested, I was one of the first people he reached out to. And when I got that phone call and he told me what he was facing, and he told me that his bail was $2.3 million, and told me that he was, facing actually multiple life sentences, I was scared. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was that 14-year-old girl again who opened up a letter from my dad. And Richard told me on the phone that he was sorry for what he did. Not just because of the ways that it harmed me and harmed his family, but he was genuinely and truly sorry for the harm that he caused to the community. And in that moment, I made the same decision that I made at age 14, and I decided to trust him. And I decided to believe that he wanted to do something different with his life. And I made a conscious effort to be supportive, to fly across the country if I needed to for a 30-minute visit in the county jail behind the glass, to drive 10 hours in the snow to whatever prison he got transferred to across the state to make sure that I would see him every weekend.
Upon arriving at the Los Angeles County Jail, within the first 15 minutes, I watched the sheriff break the leg of an incarcerated person who said some nasty things to them. I was terrified for my life in a place that I had never known, and within a few days, I got a letter from Taina. And she sent it with a picture of herself standing by a tree in Burbank. And I remember the feeling in that moment of knowing that somebody cared about me. It was the best feeling in the world. A couple days later, she came in and she visited me. She had just got her nose pierced, actually, which didn't last. It fell out. But I remember the moment that I felt looking through that glass at this person was like nothing I ever felt in my life. I was deeply seen and invested in, even in my darkest times. And as transformative as Taina's love and investment in me was, it wasn't only Taina. My community really wrapped around and supported me in a way that was completely transformative. They came together and raised over $10,000 on GoFundMe to get me a private attorney so that after fighting my case for a year, instead of getting 150 years to double life, I got 10 years and 2 strikes.
And I was glad to be there for Richard in whatever way that I could. But I wasn't really equipped to do that. I was a 22-year-old putting myself through graduate school in New Jersey at the time. I was working unpaid internships. I was supporting myself in a new state. I moved back to California to be closer to Richard and to be able to support him. But I couldn't help but notice every time I was in the visiting room that most of the people who I saw there providing the support were women. Most of the people who were there providing support were women of color. 1 in 4 women in the United States have an incarcerated loved one. 1 in 2 Black women have an incarcerated loved one. And it's upon us to pay the very expensive fees to talk on the phone. At that point, I was paying more to talk on the phone with Richard than I was for my rent. I was paying to send him packages because they have substandard food inside the prisons, and if you want somebody to eat, you have to pay to send them a package. I was paying to drive across the state to visit him, had to put new tires on my car, had to get a new car eventually to be able to make it happen. And I sacrificed my time, my money, my emotional well-being. I was consistently stressed out and scared every time I would visit because of the treatment I received from the correctional officers. And I recognize that this system that we have is not acceptable. I'm glad that I was able to provide emotional support to Richard, but the system also must do a better job to provide support and care and inspire hope for people who need it the most.
You know, I'll tell you something about prison. You can tell who has people. You can look into the eyes of an incarcerated person and see if they have somebody. Because it makes the difference between if they're going to fight to change their lives or if they're going to fight each other. When you go to prison, you don't lose your desire to be a human being or your desire to get social rewards and affection from other humans. So you're either going to get it from people who love you and want the best for you, or you're going to get it from the other people who are lost and will give it to you based on how negative you are. People don't become gang members and write words that don't make any sense to most of us across their face for no reason. That is reaching out to love from people who are willing to give it to them. And I thank God for Taina, for the people who supported me, because I was able to seek love from somebody who wanted the best for me. And it was because of this, we started reading books together, where we would send letters back and forth on the books we were reading. She was sending me books by Bell Hooks. We read All About Love. We read The Will to Change. We read We Real Cool. And I started taking the freedom that I got from these relationships and spreading this freedom on the yard. Eventually starting a program called Success Stories, where we talked about how our ideas of masculinity were holding us back from loving the people we loved and accomplishing our goals. It was an uphill battle. The first time I tried to have this conversation in a room full of incarcerated men, I got laughed out of the room. But we kept going. Eventually, Success Stories became an officially recognized California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation program. It then was recognized by, thank you. It It was then recognized by the California State Assembly for its contributions to public safety. And in 2017, CNN came in and made a documentary about it called The Feminist on Cell Block Y. Since my release in 2018, Success Stories has now been able to spread into 4 prisons, 2 county jails, 3 reentry facilities, and 2 youth centers, and hopefully we'll be working with CCEJ to do some youth work here in Long Beach as well. We've been able to hire 4 formerly incarcerated people, our facilitators when they get out of prison, and pay them full time so they can do what they do best.
And while Richard is doing that very important work to help end patriarchy and toxic masculinity and shift our culture to make our communities more safe, for my part, I wanted to shift policy to make our communities more safe. So in 2016, Richard and I co-founded an organization called Initiate Justice, where our mission is to end mass incarceration by activating the political power of the people who are most directly affected by it. So what we do is we organize people who are in prison, formerly incarcerated people, and their loved ones who support them to change state laws in California to bring their loved ones home from prison and help them be more successful when they come home. Thank you. Since we started, we have changed 4 state laws so far, including ending the felony murder rule in California, ending medical and dental copays for people in prisons and jails, and this year we're hoping to pass a ballot initiative to restore the right to vote to 50,000 people on parole in the state. We have over 24,000 members who are currently incarcerated. We have 80 organizers on the outside who have been trained very intensely in community organizing, statewide policy advocacy, and fighting for their rights. We have 3 of our organizers here today, Maria, Brenda, and Marissa. Let's clap it up for them.
Where y'all at?
Yeah, wave, say hi. But our fight isn't over. We understand that the only way that we're going to end the harms of mass incarceration and truly create systems that are based in community love and support are by investing in the leadership of the people who are most directly harmed by it. Oftentimes, people like me and Richard and Maria, Brenda, and Marissa, and so many others, we are seen as the problem. We are seen as the quote-unquote, the offender, the criminal, the perpetrator. But we are the solution. We are the ones who understand what our communities need to keep us safe. We are the ones who understand how we have been failed and what we need to do to create a better future for everybody.
Sometimes when I tell my story, people ask me, well, isn't it kind of a good thing that you went to prison? Because that's what changed you, right? People ask me, would you be who you are today if you didn't go to prison? And I want to be very clear about something. I did not transform because of prison. I transformed in spite of it. The violence and the trauma that comes with the arrest, the prosecution, the incarceration of human beings does not inspire us to be better. In fact, the science and my personal experience show that it actually makes people worse. Puts a chip on their shoulder. It puts you in a position where now you are trying to fight your own victimization, often through the only tool that you have, which is more violence. What changes people, what changed me, was love, investment, and community support. Taina's dad, myself, so many formerly incarcerated people that you may know, when you look them in the eye, just like was talked about earlier today, I hope you can see yourself. And I hope you can think about you when you're in your worst moment. Maybe you didn't commit a robbery, but you when you're at your lowest. And think about what changed you. What transformed your life? what keeps you going, and more importantly, who keeps you going. Thank you.
Thank you.